everyone, and welcome to our panel session today featuring ESG. My name is Robert Wright, and I'm a partner with Baker McKenzie's Mergers and Acquisitions and Private Equity team. My practice has a focus on the financial services and technology sectors. So it is my great pleasure that I am able to moderate the panel session today at Hong Kong Fintech Week. Environmental, social, and governance issues really seem to dominate the headlines these days as a transformational feature across industries. We would really like to take the opportunity today to understand how ESG is disrupting the finance industry, the impact on technology, and strategies fintech businesses are adopting to respond to the new regulatory landscape, as well as some of the emerging sustainability opportunities. In the last 18 months or so, we've seen the pandemic set off a series of changes in the world we live in. There is an increasing concern about how we take care of our planet, each other, and other core values across society. While governments and regulatory bodies are playing their part in requiring greater transparency and accountability from corporates on sustainability, what I find personally very interesting is that there is a clear shift, particularly amongst savvy and socially conscious investors, with a focus not only on environmental considerations, but also social and governance factors. We've also seen an uptick in shareholder activism. Corporations could face serious economic and reputational challenges with the risk of class actions for failure to disclose or comply with local market regulations. Financiers are taking a more innovative approach to steering funding towards the UN's Sustainable Development Goals with a focus on positive societal impact. As we're here today as part of the fantastic Hong Kong Fintech Week, we would like to turn now to the role of fintech in the ESG space. We're privileged to have two specialists join us today, vandePol and Samantha Lai. Minnie is the head of Baker McKenzie's Asia Pacific Compliance and Investigations Group. She has a wealth of experience advising multinationals on a variety of ESG risks, including sanctions, anti-bribery, and corruption counsel. Samantha is a special counsel in Baker McKenzie's financial services practice. She advises on a variety of financial services regulatory matters, including advising asset managers on the implications of the new ESG reporting requirements in Hong Kong. Minnie and Samantha, thank you very much for joining the panel today. Turning to Minnie first, given your experience, Minnie, working with corporates on tackling social issues within the ESG spectrum, it would be great to hear how you see fintech companies in the region shifting their views on the S in ESG, and what steps we are seeing from these corporates in actually assessing social issues.
Thanks, Rob. You're right. It is often the focus on ESG on the E part. They look at environmental and sustainability issues when considering an ESG plan or performance in terms of corporates. But actually, in truth, the concept is much broader, and we're seeing a greater focus on the S and the G. And today, I want to focus on the S, because I think that that's something that increasingly financial companies in the market are needing advice and guidance in terms of, okay, what should I be looking for in terms of performance of these investments? So if we come back to social, this S part, it really captures ethical supply chains. And as you can appreciate in COVID, that has become a major issue. Modern slavery and child labor. And we've seen that particularly in relation to geopolitical issues in Asia. Health and safety of products and of people, employment and culture within organizations, and data security and IT integrity. So these are what we call the S factors. And in part of the problem is they've often been siloed in the past. They've been in compliance or in audit or human resources or IT. They've all sort of been segmented in those different silos, and there hasn't been a consistent approach. And that means that the risks haven't been managed in a connected way or in a cohesive way. And that often results in gaps. So when funds and finance companies are looking at investments into corporates and assessing whether they've got the S right, they're often in a place where it's going to be intense to try and work out how a corporate is managing those. So we're doing a lot of advice to corporates in bringing that together and showing a more cohesive and value-driven proposition in terms of this element. So just coming back to the S component, due to media attention, a lot of companies are now appreciating that the reputational and legal risks that can arise out of poor management of the S, that could be data security, it could be cybersecurity breaches, it could be in relation to the Me Too movement, having allegations, whistleblower allegations about poor conduct of senior management, or indeed in relation to disruption of the supply chain due to aspects of the supply chain having human rights violations. So those elements need to be considered by the highest level of the corporate, and the board and management need to get behind understanding where those risks are and what the mitigation strategy is. It needs robust investigation of issues when they arise. It needs good resourcing of strengthening compliance program, reducing those silos and filling those gaps. It's not a nice to have. What we're seeing is that those companies that are doing that well, they are the ones that are deriving greater value. Because as we all know, investors these days are highly selective in where they are putting their money, and there is a lot of money to be invested. So for companies to capture that investment, they need to actually put the resource and time and effort in relation to managing these S risks well. And in fact, it's interesting because what we're finding is that regulators globally are saying we are actually tired of waiting for things to be done voluntarily. We've waited for companies to perhaps do the right thing for the right reasons, and in fact are becoming a lot more intrusive in terms of requiring and mandating these requirements. So for example, on the 10th of March this year, by an overwhelming majority, the EU Parliament passed a resolution that directs a new law which effectively requires companies to conduct due diligence throughout their value chains on ESG matters. So in other words, under that directive, certain companies, either EU companies or operating in the EU, so of course that's got quite a wide remit, will be required to assess all potential adverse impacts on human rights, the environment, and good governance in their operations and business relationships. So that is going to actually require companies to do a more thorough process and in fact disclose if things are found to be wanting. So this is the pattern that we are seeing. If we're looking around the corners of what regulation is going to look like from a global perspective, what we're going to see is that companies are going to be required and mandated to show how they're performing in relation to this area. That's a good thing for fintech companies. It's because as investors, they will have more transparency. And I think that is going to be helpful in terms of leveling out the playing field and ensuring that the investments are well managed and don't provide some unwanted surprises, which can, of course, damage the value long term.
Thanks, Minnie. That is really fascinating. And on the topic of supply chain, it was really interesting to see that Germany recently passed new laws on supply chain due diligence, which comes into effect in 2023. So it sounds like it is really an opportunity for fintech businesses and the broader industry to really take a note of what's coming up. Turning closer to home and the Hong Kong market, investment in ESG has been a hot topic, of course, amongst the investment community. And on a global scale, the amount of global ESG fund assets has climbed to a record high amount to nearly $3 trillion in Q3 2021, according to recent statistics from the Institute of International Finance. Samantha, given the rapid uptake by investors and fund managers, including new product offerings we're seeing coming to market, what does the uptake in ESG investment and increasing ESG regulations actually mean for fintech companies? And what are the opportunities and challenges for fintechs?
That's an interesting question, Rob. So starting with the opportunities first, and I'll move on to challenges. One of the themes that we have seen coming out of recent regulatory requirements is enhanced reporting and disclosure requirements. For example, the SFC announced back in August this year, new requirements which will apply to SFC licensed fund managers. This relate to requiring them to consider climate-related risk in their investment and risk management processes, as well as to require them to make appropriate disclosures in order to meet investor demands and to combat greenwashing. The SFC has proposed two types of requirements: the baseline requirements, which apply to all SFC licensed fund managers, and secondly, more onerous requirements, which will apply only to larger fund managers, by which I mean fund managers with AUM of at least 8 billion Hong Kong dollars. Now, when it comes to the reporting, the enhanced reporting and disclosure requirements, we envisage that there will be challenges to complying with these requirements. Firstly, because there's a lack of common disclosure standards by investee companies. And secondly, the investee companies apply different assumptions and methodologies. And in order to deal with these challenges, we think that there'll be a need to find solutions, mainly to address data inconsistencies, so as to make the fund manager's life easier in evaluating their fund investments. For example, we see the use of AIs, artificial intelligence, in order to scrap inconsistent climate metrics as well as ESG data across different sources, and to be able to do that quickly and promptly as well. And in addition to that, fund managers will need tools, monitoring tools, in order to track climate and ESG performance or any changes to their investee companies. They will need tech solutions that will be able to feed real-time data to a fund manager's reporting system and to flag any issues. And we think all of these is going to make a huge business opportunity. It's going to give a huge business opportunity for fintech companies. Now, coming on to challenges, the rise of ESG investment, we think will also pose a number of challenges as well to fintech companies, and mainly that's in respect of how they will be able to obtain funding from institutional investors. So some of the things that they will need to think about, not an exhaustive list, will be some of these issues in terms of attracting funding from institutional investors. Firstly, whether the institutional investors, how they will integrate climate or ESG factors into their investment processes. Secondly, something to think about would be whether these institutional investors want to know about the portfolio carbon footprint of the fintech companies which they invest into. And thirdly, whether investors expect fintech companies to have an ESG compliance program in place. These are some of the important things that fintech companies will want to think about for them to attract funding from institutional investors.
Very interesting. Thanks, Samantha. And interested in your views on the impact ESG reporting requirements has had or will have on fund managers, and how asset managers and fund managers in Hong Kong actually are set up to deal with enhanced reporting requirements. And are we seeing fintech solutions help support the needs of these managers? And I'll turn to Minnie separately on a related point. Thanks, Samantha.
So from the perspective of fund managers in terms of complying with enhanced disclosure and reporting requirements, which we see starting to apply to them globally, where a fund manager, where a particular asset or fund manager is on this journey would depend very much on a couple of main factors. And in particular, we see two types of fund managers which would generally be further along the journey. Firstly, it will be fund managers with affiliates in Europe. And why is that the case? Because they will be able to leverage on implementation work which has already been done in Europe. And also they'll be able to make use of what is known as substituted compliance and rely on the European approach and make smaller adjustments as required in order to tick the Hong Kong regulatory requirements boxes. And secondly, in respect of fund managers who manage funds which have an ESG focus element and where these funds are subject to SFC or other regulatory requirements already. So in other words, right from the inception of the funds, they are already ESG focused. The fund managers of such funds would generally be further along the curve in terms of complying with ESG related reporting and disclosure requirements. As for other fund managers who are just starting up on the journey of the enhanced reporting and disclosure requirements, obviously they need to start off with understanding what the requirements are. They need to assess what resources they already have in place and what are the additional information and systems which they need to put in place in order to comply with the enhanced reporting and disclosure requirements. Now, secondly, moving on to fintech. So this is about the more practical aspect of complying with the reporting and disclosure requirements. And essentially, we're talking about gathering the data and information required in order to comply with the reporting requirements. So in order to ensure that investment strategies or specific investment meet the relevant climate risk criteria that's required by the regulators, a testing process is quite essential to that. And there is a quantitative approach as well as a qualitative approach to that. With a quantitative approach, it involves gathering a large amount of data and to ensure that such data is suitable and it fits back to the fund managers as well to facilitate the testing process. So obviously other fintech or RegTech options can also be considered. These include off-the-shelf tools, scenario analysis, tracking engagement, as well as other methods of performing carbon footprint calculations. Building all of these tools internally, we expect that to be quite a challenging process. So something to think about there is to leverage off external solutions which are available.
Thanks very much, Samantha. Minnie, just to close, I know you've been monitoring quite closely some of the regional developments in the ESG space. Interested in your final thoughts on upcoming regional ESG trends or key areas to watch?
I read an interesting article today written by Annika Bradley of The Age in Australia, and she was talking about this recent conference, the 2021 Morningstar Investor Conference in Australia. So what that obviously was an interesting discussion about the fact that many investors now consider sustainable and ESG centric products as the way forward. So there's no question about that. It's not just about the social contract, it's also about the investment opportunity itself. And in fact, the value of it, as you mentioned, the global figures, the regional figures are quite amazing. According to this Morningstar conference data, the flows of money into these type of ESG products in the June quarter alone stood at $3 billion. And that was the highest on record. And that brought the sustainable investment figure in Australasia to $33 billion. So we're talking, significant opportunities here. So I think the key, if we come back to, is that as an investor, I would want a company to be able to produce to me sufficient evidence that robustly shows that they don't just have policies and procedures, but that they've implemented on the ground. And that if they've had issues, they've investigated and they've remediated those issues. This comes back to my practice of compliance. Compliance is no longer a sexy word, Rob, but ESG is. And the fact is, these risks have to be managed, and it has to be demonstratively managed to provide the value that investors are looking for. That's what I would be doing. I'd be getting corporates to say, look, show me exactly the evidence that you have to support my decision in terms of investing, and that will drive the right corporate behavior. It will drive the ability for people to have confidence in relation to these investments. And I think that is the future.
Thank you both for your insights today. A great snapshot of some of the ESG hot topics amongst really a tidal wave of new developments in this space. Thank you to our audience members for joining us today, and we hope you all enjoy the remainder of your Hong Kong Fintech Week. Thank you.